Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ignorant Intellectual on Media. Today, I thought we'd do a mixed haul because things are piling up on my desk, and I need to use my desk for work, so I need to get rid of a whole bunch of stuff here. So let's get into it. First, we'll get rid of some books. All right. Here's Sir Thomas Malory's Lament d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur. Basically, it's one of the main books. If you want to read up on King Arthur and his Round Table and the Arthurian, ignorant intellectual Arthurian legend, Malory's book is one of the ones that you need to read. There's some other ones as well, but this one is probably the main one. I would start with this one because it's basically what he does is he basically takes all the stuff that was written about King Arthur before him, and he kind of compiles it all into this book, takes all that information and compiles it into this book. There are a bunch of other books about King Arthur, but this one seems to be the most popular. All right, so I would suggest you read it if you like King Arthur's. All right, The Old Curiosity Shop, one of Dickens's novels. It's not one of his main ones that everybody reads, but after you get through like Tale of Two Cities and a bunch of his other ones, David Copperfield and so on and so forth, if you really like his stuff, which I do, then you just continue on with his more minor stuff, and this is one of his more minor books, part of the Penguin Classics. This edition is. All right. Then we got, that was Then, This Is Now. All right. So this is S.E. Hinton wrote I think a series of 4 or 5 books. The first one that she wrote, now she was a teenager when she wrote this. I think she was like 16 when she wrote these books. The one that made the most impact was the first one, which was called The Outsiders. And I think this one is the second one. And then you have, I think Tex is another one. And can't remember the fourth one. Anyways, I'll put it down here. Anyway, so this one, the first one, basically it's about, her books are about, the outcasts, the people that aren't in the mainstream, the poor and the slighted, so you'd have like in the first book, you'd have like the Sosas, which are this more of a upper class, richer people that go to this high school, and then you got all the poor, which are called the greasers or whatever, right? There's like conflict between the two of them. This kind of continues on that. She basically doesn't write sequels to her books, but basically there's usually a minor character of some sort that's in a book that's previous, that she takes that minor character and kind of puts it into another story kind of thing. So they're not really, sequels. They're more like offshoots from each book to each book, and this one was really good, but it's her first one, The Outsiders, that everybody mentions to read, right? So we got Hobbes' Leviathan, and this one is from Hackett Publishing. Even though this book, if you can notice, it's got a plastic coating to its paper, and the plastic, somebody probably left this out on a ledge or somewhere near the sun, and you can see the plastic coating is kind of wrinkled. I don't know if can you see that? All right. And it doesn't matter. This book will still sell because Hobbes is, there's a group of them, political philosophers that have been around, like, so starting with things like Aristotle's, well, probably Plato's Republic, and Aristotle's Politics, and then you go forward from there. You got like, the English and the French and the German philosophers when it comes to this, like, Leviathan and John Locke's second treatise on government, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, I can't remember the name of it, but Rousseau's book on political philosophy. There's a bunch of them that you can read. It's always been my favorite kind of philosophy to read. I'm more into the political side of philosophy, so Leviathan is one of them. Leviathan is basically what? It's this huge sea creature or whatever, and what he does is he relates that to, he goes through all the different forms of government, and he argues which one would be the best form of government. And basically, he comes to the conclusion, if I remember correctly, that a monarchy is the best. But I think he caveats it. All right, so you have a dictatorship, whether it's military or, with a despot, with a fascist leader or whatever. You have that type of thing, right? Then you have communist country, all right, where it's basically totalitarian as well, but it's a group, right? So you can vote, but you can only vote for one party. So you may be voting for different personalities, but they're all part of the same system, right? It's not like you're voting, with any choice, right? So it kind of breeds a cult of personality in those ones. But and then you have a monarchy, all right, and then you have a democracy, right? So and I think he may have mentioned a couple other ones, but basically, so what he concludes, or what he chooses a monarchy because monarchy is not as bad as a fascist type of state, um, and people can look up to a king or a queen, right? And then you can get stuff done pretty quickly because once the king or the queen orders it, then it gets done, right? So, which is one of the limits of democracy because you got to argue over everything before you get anything done, right? So it's much quicker. But I can't remember if it was Locke or him that mentioned that democracy is like the best of the worst kind of government. You understand what I mean? So if you have a king, if that king is benevolent and looks on his people more than he does himself, then that's a great form of government, all right? Because he's looking out for his people, he's trying to best manage how to have his people prosper and so on and so forth, right? But if because it's done through heredity, when you come to, and you always do, you come to a bad king, all right? Then your life is a living hell, basically, right? So even though, let's say, a benevolent king is better than a democracy, an evil king is like much worse, and it's better to have something in between that, which is a democracy, basically. So a democracy isn't as good as a benevolent king, but it never devolves into an evil king. So it's a better form of government in many ways, right? So anyways, he goes through all of that and his reasons for it and what his conclusions are and the reasons for his conclusions, right? It's a really, really, really good political philosophy book if you haven't read it. All right, the Buddha and his teachings. Basically, Buddha, the what everybody thinks is that big fat man sitting down underneath a tree. Basically, his teachings on how to live life, and it's not really, I don't know, Buddhism probably the closest. I think people connect more with this, if you can call it a religion, or this way of thinking, more than any other Eastern way of thinking. But it's basically set for you not to participate, basically, because everything in this world is basically temporary, and it's not nihilistic, but do you understand what I mean? How to get inner peace is to let go of everything that's around you and find your joy from within, kind of idea. I'm no expert at Buddhism, but you have the idea of what it is, and people really love books on Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, this type of Buddhism, Zen as well. So any of these books that I find, I always pick up and I'll just resell them so that I can buy movies. All right, so that's Buddhism. All right, Emily Carr, one of the great Canadian writers. This is Clee Wick. All right, I've heard about this book over and over, but I've never read it. So let me read the back of it to see exactly what it is so I'm not confusing myself and you. The legendary Emily Carr was primarily a painter, but she first gained recognition as a writer. Her first book, published in 1941, was titled Clee Wick, or Laughing One, in honor of the name of the native people out of the West Coast gave her as an intrepid young woman. The book was a hit with both critics and the public, won the prestigious Governor General's Award. If you don't know what the Governor General's Award is, basically the Pulitzer for Canada, all right? Award, and has been in print ever since. Emily Carr wrote these 21-word sketches after visiting and living with native people, painting their totem poles and villages, many of them in wild and remote areas. She tells her stories with beauty, pathos, and a vivid awareness of the comedy of the people and situation. So it's basically native writings from a non-native, right? So a lot of Canadians have read it, but this is a bit of a lament. But when I go out and I look for books or movies or other things to either add to my collection or to resell so that I have money to buy things from my collection. Um, Canadian literature is out there wherever I go, right? And I do pick it up and I do read it. Um, but so many Canadians just don't read Canadian literature. I don't know what it is. They don't watch Canadian television or movies. I know there's a bit of a access issue. I mean, it's easier in Canada to access American and even British culture easier than it is to access Canadian culture. All right? We seem to be dominated by the English, the French, and especially the Americans when it comes to culture in our country. That's why you see Canadians have such an international way of thinking. They don't. The pride in Canada is mostly because of how well we relate to everybody. Do you understand what I mean? It's less. I don't know. I may be making judgments that aren't true or whatever, but basically, we're not as strongly like the Americans are with their flag and their country and America first and all that kind of stuff. Canadians aren't really that way. We think more internationally than we do domestically. A lot of us, anyways, do, because there's so many people from around the world that live here, right? So we're almost like an international country with a Canadian border, right? So within the Canadian borders. And the Americans are the same way. It's not like their demographics is much different than ours. It's just that they put America first and then everything else. So you don't really see somebody saying like an African Canadian or an Italian Canadian. They're Guyanese or they're Italian. We don't really worry about. We consider them all Canadians, even though they say they're Italian or whatever. They don't really say they're Canadian, right? You understand what I mean? So there isn't a huge super pride of Canada, other than how good it is to live here and how much culture is around us because of its internationality, right? So that's what makes Canada proud, that we're a good example for the world on how all these different cultures have meshed within each other inside our country, and there's less strife than you would think there would be, right? So and the reason why it is because we're such a new country. I mean, the caveat to the native people that with all the mass immigration and colonization that happened into Canada, but we're like an international basic country, you know what I mean? So and we don't look at it as detrimental to our country if people look at themselves as coming from somewhere else and living here, type of idea. Anyways, I'm digressing. The point I'm trying to make is our native culture, culture from Canada by Canadians is down on the list of things to do. So if we're going to go read a book, we'd prefer to read the best books in the world. And if they happen to be French, they happen to be English, they happen to be Japanese, they happen to be American, then we'll read them, right? And if a Canadian has reached that pinnacle of success and respect, then we'll read it. So for example, we'll read something like Charles Dickens or William Shakespeare or William Faulkner or you understand what I mean? We'll read French authors. We'll read it. Just how good is the book, and if it's really good, then we'll read it, right? You understand? And if they happen to be Canadian, then they happen to be Canadian. So the problem is that the stuff that's coming in and around Canada, you won't notice it as much, so therefore people don't pay as much attention to it. There's a lot of great Canadian movies that Canadians haven't even heard of, right? And the reason why it is because of so much American and British and French culture coming into Canada, all right? So it's like there's a Canadian culture, but you have to actually go look for it, right? So this book is an example. See, it's been published ever since it was put out, right? But I bet you if I asked half the Canadians in Canada if they've ever heard of this book, they would probably say no, right? So So that's what I mean by that. So we'll read international, we'll watch international movies, music, everything. It's all international to us. And if a Canadian, so for example, in Canada, it might be Margaret Atwood. Like everybody's heard of The Handmaid's Tale from Margaret Atwood, internationally as well as domestically, right? So that has reached the pinnacle of competing with other countries' culture, and therefore we know it as well, right? So if it's a movie, it's like a lot of our directors, let's say, go to the States or elsewhere to direct movies. So, like something like, I don't know, Adam McGoyan, like The Sweet Hereafter. People have heard of that movie. So it's a Canadian movie, but it's reached international recognition, right? You understand what I mean? So how we watch Canadian, like David Cronenberg would be another person. Like everybody knows David Cronenberg. He's a Canadian. He made a bunch of Canadian films before he started making films in the United States, and everybody knows those films, right? Because he's reached that zenith or pinnace that he's up with all the best, right? So that's where we get but the native stuff, the stuff that's in Canada, a lot of stuff that's really good that comes out of Canada. Many Canadians have never heard of. It's just because we're so dominated by so many other people. Like, France is larger than us. The British Isles is larger than us. The United States is like 10 times as big as us, and it's our neighbor to the south. So you get all that stuff coming in, and Canadian stuff kind of gets pushed to the side if it doesn't kind of fight its way through it to get up there with all the other international culture, right? So anyway, so there's a lot of stuff that I may show you in a video of Canadian stuff that you have never heard of, even if you're Canadian. So it's kind of it's understandable in one way, but it's kind of disappointing in the other, right? So, all right, next up is Machiavelli's selected political writing. So basically, you have The Prince, which is he's most famous for, and then you have selections from the Discourses and Letter to Batory here. If you haven't read The Prince, basically it's Machiavelli's gift to, I think it was a duke who was gaining power, and he didn't want to be left aside. He was kind of like a civil servant, so he gave it as a gift on how to rule. And basically, some of the stuff in it's pretty, pretty nasty. So, all right, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is on life, and after that, she's one of she has a few books on death and dying, so she sells pretty well in the secondary market. So I picked that up. Troilus and Cressida, I don't know, ignorant intellectual, by Chaucer. I'm not sure how to pronounce those two names, but basically, this is a Broadview edition. These are such good editions, and they're Canadian. And out of all the different, so you have Penguin, you have Oxford, you have Signet, you have all these different publishers that publish classic works. Well, Broadview is one of them, and it's specifically targeted towards the student and the teacher. And out of all of them, these ones are the most difficult to sell, but they still do sell occasionally, right? And I like picking them up because they're Canadian, you know what I mean? So anyways, they're really good. If you like academic, like if you like reading just for enjoyment, then you're going to read. It doesn't really matter which edition you pick up. But if you want a more of an academic study in a book that you're reading, then these Broadview editions are extremely good in that way, right? So that's that. We got Gibran's The Procession, which is a bunch of poems. He's most known for The Prophet, which people have like, they think it's like profound and extremely amazing, but when I read it, it was like, okay, it's just basic common sense. Why don't people have basic common sense, right? Anyway, so he did drawings and poems for this book. So then we got Kim from Kipling. All right, so he's most of the Jungle Books and all that, but this is another one of his books that people like to read. I haven't read it. Kim is the story of Kimball O'Hara, the orphan son of an Irish soldier who spends his childhood as a vagabond in Lahore. With an old Tibetan Lama, he travels through India, enthralled by the roaring world of the landscape and cities of rich colored bazaars and immense diversity of people. All right, so Kipling is an English writer, but he spent most of his time in India. So he's kind of like a mix, right? He's English, but much of his experience is in India. So when he writes a lot about India rather than, let's say, from England or whatever. We got Huxley's Brave New World Revisited. I don't know if you've read Brave New World. If you haven't, I highly suggest that you do read it. It's one of the great dystopian books. Anyway, so Huxley looks back on that book like 30 years later, and he writes this essay, long essay or study of it, looking back on it and seeing how a lot of the stuff that he wrote in it, because it was written in the 1930s, right? Whether any of it has come true or whatever, right? So it's an interesting thing. I know I can resell that, so that's why I picked that up. What else do we have here? We have America by Kafka, another book. Kafka is extremely popular writer and reader, and so I picked that up, even though it's an old book that cost $175 when it first came out. I can still sell it because of the author, right? There's just some authors, Kafka is one of them, that you can sell books that are older if they're still in really good condition. Whereas in other authors, if you pick those up and you try to sell these old books, people won't pick it up unless you sell it for $1 or whatever. Right? So, anyway, Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. I've spoken about this book many times. Hemingway is one of the Americans' greatest writers. So Stuart Little, this one, and Charlotte's Web is probably E.B. White's most famous children's books. So he's always good to sell. And speaking of Hinton and the Outsiders, there's the book. All right, so this is her first of a series of 4 or 5 books about, teen angst. All right, Oryx and Crake. Speaking of Margaret Atwood, so this is the trilogy, the Mad Adam trilogy. It's about a dystopian future where they started screwing around with genetics so much that it basically killed off all the people, and you have hybrid animals and other things. It's quite an interesting read, the trilogy, right? If you haven't read it, Atwood. And then we got The Golden Ass. All right. I found these 3 at a thrift store for $2 each. So I found The Golden Ass by however you pronounce his name, and Caesar's The Conquest of Gaul. All right. And then Virgil's greatest writing, the Aeneid, Ignorant Intellectual. All right, so those will sell. Okay, I'm just trying to get through the books as quickly as possible. Then we got Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess. Bobby Fischer, one of the greatest chess masters of all time. So I know he's Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I mentioned this book many a time before. If you haven't read this, you should read it. It's extremely, extremely good. It'll change your way of thinking. All right. Kind of mixes Plato and Zen Buddhism and other things in it. The Tao Te Ching, all right, by Lao Tzu, basically one of the 2 main books in Taoism, basically. All right, if you haven't read that, it's quite profound as well. All right, so and then I found these, and I'm taking a chance on these. I don't know if these will resell it or not. But basically, Jack White, who wrote The Once and Future King, which is another book on King Arthur. Remember I mentioned the Lamar d'Arthur by Mallory? Well, a more modern version. There's 2 main books, modern books, like have written in the 20th century or whatever, that are really good when it comes to King Arthur, and White wrote one. It's called The Once and Future King. And who was the girl that wrote the other one? It was called The Mists of Avalon. I can't remember the name of the author, but I'll put it up here. All right. So The Mists of Avalon, that's really good. That one is extremely good because it's written from a female's perspective. So basically, most of the writing when it comes to King Arthur is written by men about King Arthur, and the Knights of the Round Table and so on and so forth. Well, what was her name? Anyways, the woman who wrote The Mists of Avalon decided to write the King Arthur legend, but write it from the perspective of Morgana Le Fay, the witch or whatever, right? And she wrote the whole book about the witch, and basically her book is written in a time period where Christianity is taking over from, the pagan religions, right? So Morgan Le Fay is a pagan, a witch, and King Arthur has converted to Christianity, but he's of the old ways as well. So he's so there's that religious aspect to her book as well, right? And it tells the King Arthur, extremely, extremely good book if you haven't read it, The Mists of Avalon, all right? But he wrote The Once and Future King, which is another great book on the Arthurian legend, right? But this is his trilogy. What is this trilogy? The Templar trilogy, all right? So it's about knights and everything else, and he wrote 3 huge tomes, all right? They're all like 1,000 pages, 800 pages. Which is this one? 900 pages. This one is 900 pages. So it's like you got yourself a read if you read these 3 books by Jack White. I think because of his reputation with King Arthur, and now these things are about, the Knights Templar. I don't know if you know the history of that, but I'm not going to get into it here. But I haven't read these books, but extremely good. And usually paperbacks, when I pick them up, are $7.99, $8.99, $10 sometimes. And these ones, $13.50. That's how big they are, right? So I know somebody who's going to enjoy reading these. All right, so those are the books. Let's get to some CDs that I found. Okay, so first up is Headhunters by Herbie Hancock. Hancock is one of the great jazz musicians, and this is probably his most famous CD and his best CD. So if you haven't listened to this, listen. It's hard to describe how jazz sounds unless you listen to jazz. You can mention the instruments that it's involved and how it makes you feel or whatever, but you just got to listen to it to know whether. All right, and then you got Kraftwerk's Tour de France soundtracks. Very good CD, but their stuff from the 70s is their best. They're basically pioneered electronic music. Before electronic music became popular, they're the ones that kind of screwed around with electronic equipment and stuff and made like musical instruments out of it and came out with a bunch of good albums back in the 70s, like Autobahn or The Man Machine, or my personal favorite is Trans-Europe Express. If you haven't listened to that, that's really good as well. It's kind of like robotic with electronic music, extremely good. And now this one isn't one of their old ones, this is one of their newer ones, but it's still extremely good if you haven't listened to it. And then I found these 3, the 3 greatest albums put out by The Boss, by Bruce Springsteen, all right? If you're only going to listen to his best stuff, then you're going to be listening to Born in the USA, all right? Born to Run, and Darkness at the Edge of Town. Those are his 3 greatest albums. These 2 from the 70s and this one from the 80s. This is probably his biggest and most popular album. It's the one that has Born in the USA, Cover Me, No Surrender, Glory Days, Dancing in the Dark, My Hometown. It was like big, almost as big as like Thriller by Michael Jackson that came out around the same time, right? So extremely big. But he made his name in the 70s with these 2 albums. Extremely good albums. So if you like The Boss, what I'm going to do is I'm going to resell these, put them all in one ad or whatever, and they should sell. All right, because I already have them in my collection. We got Ben Harper and Charlie Musselwhite in a 2013 mashup between the 2 of them. So 2 of the big names in blues. All right, and I haven't listened to this album yet, but I found it $2. So I said, let's listen to it, even though they're getting up in age, right? So, and Madman Across the Water is Elton John's third. I think it might be his second album. Came out in 1971. It's the one that has a Tiny Dancer on it. And what are the other ones? Rotten Peaches, All the Nasties, Madman Across the Water, Goodbye. But I think Leave On and Tiny Dancer are the 2 main singles that they put out on this album. So it's pretty good. Then we got one of the great voices out of African American culture, this jazz blues pioneer. And that's basically 16 of her songs in it. Bessie Smith, I'm talking about. All right. So anytime you see these, CDs are passe, but they seem to be making a bit of a comeback. But it's mostly vinyl that everybody wants, right? I mean, if people are sick of digital and they want to get back to, listening to music um, the cool way or whatever, mostly everybody goes to vinyl and listens to vinyl. But some people do return to CDs and listen to CDs. And these groups, it's called Columbia Jazz Masterpiece. They all have that purple. They take the old albums off of LP and then they put them on CD, and they put the album cover on it, but then they frame it in a purple, like a purple frame. And anytime you see these ones, just pick it up. It's good stuff, man. Every time I see one of these and I listen to it, I'm not disappointed in them, right? Then we got Helix, a Canadian band, and this is the early years. It's two of their first albums or EPs in one collection. Helix is like basically a heavy rock band from Canada. And then we got Carl Perkins, My Kind of Country. All right, so Perkins, he's got that old school type of country that was kind of lost since Garth Brooks and Shania Twain kind of took over back in the 90s, whatever. But if you like the old school country, Perkins is one of the good ones. All right, so those are all the CDs. What else do we have? Ah, yes, movies. We always finish with movies, don't we? Okay, so I found two Blu-rays in the last couple of days that I hadn't had on Blu-ray. One of them is The Bucket List. All right, so this one is a Rob Reiner film. All right, and basically, I collect Rob Reiner. I like he's got a feel good about his movies. You ever notice that? Stand By Me and the others that he made, they're all, I don't know, him and Ron Howard seem to have that Americana type of movie or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, they do thrillers and do other things, but like they make good feel-good movies, if you know what I mean. Anyways, so this one, it basically stars Morgan Freeman and Jack Nicholson, and Jack Nicholson is super rich and owns a whole bunch of hospitals, and Morgan Freeman is a mechanic who ends up being diagnosed with cancer, ends up in one of Jack Nicholson's hospitals, and Jack Nicholson is in there because he was diagnosed with cancer as well. They both go through chemotherapy together, and what happens is afterwards, the chemo doesn't work all that well, and so they're both given like short periods of time to live. So they decide that they're going to go on an adventure, and what they did was they write down what's called a bucket list, which is a whole bunch of things that you always wanted to do before you die, before you kick the bucket, right? So a bucket list. So they started fulfilling their bucket lists together, and since Nicholson has more money than God, money was no object or whatever, right? So it's a very good movie. I wouldn't put it as one of the greatest movies of all time, but nobody would ever be disappointed in watching this movie. All right, and the second one, this isn't it. I'll put it up here because I think it's still over there, but I got my microphone on. Yeah, it's still over there. So it's called, I don't know what it's called. Crap. Okay, what I'll do is I'll leave that one and I'll review it in my next video. All right. I also have A Star Is Born. I haven't watched this yet. This is basically the third film this has been made of, right? You had the early one, then you had the one with Barbara Streisand in it. This one has Lady Gaga in it. All right. Any other ones? Any other movies? Ah, yes. These ones, I think I already had. Bend of the River. Okay, so did I do this one the last weekend? I can't remember if I did it. It's a Billy Wilder film. I haven't done it. It's part of the Masters of Cinema collection. This one is number 45 in the collection. All right, and this is basically about alcoholism. All right, there's some really good. What was that Jack Lemmon film? I can't remember the name of it. I'll put it up here. There's another really good film on alcoholism. Then there was that one with Clean and Sober. There was one with a female. I think it was Sandra Bullock. Was it Sandra Bullock? That was pretty good. But the one with Michael Keaton was really good. Clean and Sober, I think it was called. Anyways, I'll put it up here again. But this one is probably the best out of all that I've seen on alcoholism. And this is basically called The Lost Weekend. It's about a man who has a brother and a girlfriend or a wife, and he's heavy on the bottle, right? And he can't do anything else. And he knows he's addicted, and he knows he's trying to not be addicted to it, but he always fails, and he's miserable with himself. Anyways, it's Ray Milland is the guy, right? And extremely good acting in that. And Billy Wilder directed. Have you ever seen a Billy Wilder film that hasn't been good in some way? I mean, if you watch older cinema, this one came out in 45, all the way back in 45. Extremely good film if you haven't watched it, all right? And we got another one. This one's number 42 in the collection. This is Rumblefish. Remember I mentioned S.E. Hinton with, this is the third one. So you have Tex, you have Rumblefish, you have The Outsiders, and That Was Then, This Is Now. And they're all made into movies, right? And Francis Ford Coppola did this one, and I think he did The Outsiders as well. And basically, this stars Matt Damon and what's his name from the wrestler? What's that guy's name? Mickey Rourke, all right? And it has Diane Lane is also in it, Dennis Hopper, Nicolas Cage, Chris Penn, and Tom Waits, and some others. Basically, this is about, small town kid, who has an older brother that's a legend in the town. And I don't know how to describe it. It's a bit of a strange film. Coppola gives it like this, I don't know, film noir look to it or something. You know what I mean? It's kind of, it was in black and white, by the way. It's, it was from 1983, but he made it in black and white. And Matt Damon isn't the greatest of actors, but he did a half decent job in this. And Mickey Rourke did a good job in it as well. But it's basically about a lot of existential type of stuff in this. You know what I mean? About what does it mean to exist and things, right? And so I was kind of up in the air on it. I kind of like The Outsiders, his film, better than this one, but he did a pretty good job in this one. So that's another. This one is number 45. And then we have The Mikado, which is Criterion Collection number 559. This is basically a Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Gilbert and Sullivan. Gilbert and Sullivan musical. I sat down and I started watching the first 15-20 minutes of it, and I said, okay, this is just definitely is not for me. All right, so I just stopped watching it. But I collect the Criterion Collection, so I'll add it to the collection. I'm not sure if you like musicals, but I do like musicals. It's just this one didn't do anything for me. And now we have The Emperor's New Groove. This is quite a good movie. I don't know if you've ever watched this Disney film. When they kind of switched over from that old style of animation and they moved into more of a CGI type of animation. Although this one I don't think is CGI, is it? I think it might be. Anyways, it's been like such a long time since I've seen this, but it's quite funny. You have what's his name from, that guy that has that quite funny voice. He always does these cartoon characters, and he was also in I think it was the third Men in Black film, where Will Smith tells him he's not, the Men in Black is not for him or whatever. Right? So, anyways, it's quite a fun film if you haven't seen it. And last but not least, let's do these. I found these two, Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2, on really nice Steelbooks. All right, so I don't know if you've seen Ghostbusters, but it's one of the greatest films of the 1980s. But a group of scientists who discover that there are ghosts, and they go about whenever they haunt a building, they go in and they capture that ghost. But there's like this haunting that's becoming more and more. All these ghosts are escaping into New York because of this sinister, evil creature that's going to be coming into New York, and they're going to have to battle it, right? And it's such a classic film with like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. I fucking laughed my head off at that. Like, and anyways, you got to watch the film. And the second film wasn't as good, but if you really, really like the first film, if you can imagine yourself back in the 80s and you go see that film, right? and you're laughing your ass off, and it's quite funny, right? And Bill Murray is at the height of his powers, right? In the 80s, right? And then, you know, like 5 years later, they announce that, you know, there's a second film coming out. Man, you just go see that film because you enjoy the first one, even though the second one isn't as good. But hey, it's hard to beat Ghostbusters anyway. So all right, and then they went crazy and they did a female version of Ghostbusters, and they did Afterlife Ghostbusters, and all these. They just continue, you know, to pound the fucking franchise down into the ground or whatever. But the first one, really, really, really good. If you haven't seen it, all right. And I actually had this in a digipack, both movies in one case. So I'm kind of going against what I usually do, is wanting to shrink the amount of space that each movie takes up, because you know you have such limited space for stuff after a while. So I actually increased my space with these two, because there was a Blu-ray digibook that was quite thin that I had for these movies, but I couldn't resist picking up Steelbooks. I really like Steelbooks for some reason. All right. So that's everything. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me a thumbs up. Think about subscribing. I would enjoy that. And you have a great day, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye for now.